Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Leanne Shriver. I'm the labor policy intern this summer at TCF, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion. So for any of you a little unfamiliar with our work, the Century Foundation is a nonpartisan think tank based in New York, and we do policy research on current issues, and the policy areas, as you may have guessed, include labor policy, which will help ground tonight's discussion. As many of you know, tonight is one of our networking events for young professionals in New York City. And we will have one more this summer, but you'll hear about that a little later tonight. Before we get started with the discussion, I'm going to ask you all a few questions to warm up the crowd. So first, how many of you that you know of have a grandparent who is in a union? Okay. Wow. How many of you have a parent who was or is in a union? And how many of you are in or have been in a union? Okay. How about, of the people in this room, how many of you are in a private sector union? Public sector union? Okay. And then how many of you have participated in a protest or a demonstration related to workers' rights? Good. And finally, how many of you are optimistic about the future of labor unions? That's sad. Okay. So I'll now
introduce to warm us up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll encourage you to become more optimistic. So I'll introduce tonight's experts. First, we have Rick Kahlenberg of TCF. Rick has worked on a number of issues involving inequality, and he is a co-author of Why Labor Organizing Should Be a Civil Right, and a recent TCF report called Virtual Labor Organizing.
Do you want a close-up, John?
Signed autograph copies.
But you don't have a copy of the article with you.
No. Well, maybe I do. I do.
True.
Yes.
So a report called Virtual Labor Organizing, Could Technology Help Reduce Income Inequality? There it is. Okay. Next, we are also happy to be joined by Michelle Chen. Michelle is a contributing writer for The Nation, as well as a contributing editor to In These Times and Dissent Magazine, and associate editor at Culture Strike, and she is also a co-producer of Dissent's Belabored podcast. And finally, we have Michelle Miller. Michelle is the co-founder and co-director of coworker.org, a global platform for employees to run workplace campaigns and learn organizing strategies from each other. She has also spent a decade working at the Service Employees International Union. So thank you, three of you, for agreeing to discuss the future of labor organizing with us. So to get started, I thought it would be interesting to get a little bit of context for the labor movement. We hear a lot about its decline these days and that we should be concerned about it, but what did it look like at its peak?
So you're looking at me, Leanne.
I'm making strong eye contact.
We have to the
yes. No, I'm not going to be insulted by the fact that you asked the balding older guy this question about the history. So, this is a major change we've seen in this country. At the early part of the 20th century, labor was where it is today. It was on its back. It wasn't very strong. But then in 1935, FDR and the Congress got together and passed the National Labor Relations Act that had a big impact on accelerating the growth of labor, so that by the mid-1950s, you had a third of private sector workers who were in the labor movement, members of unions. And that had two big impacts on our country. One is that we saw the tremendous growth of the middle class. There was broadly shared prosperity in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And we also saw the birth of a politically powerful movement, right? We would not have the Civil Rights Act. We would not have Medicare if it hadn't been for the labor movement. So it had an enormous impact, I think, for the better in this country. And then we started to see the decline really in the 60s, 70s, and accelerated in the 80s, where labor saw its share of the private sector and public sector movement decline dramatically. I was banned from using PowerPoint, but I did sneak in a couple of slides on the handout that you have, which I'll refer to. I don't know if you guys got them up here.
No.
There may be a couple down there.
Wow.
But just
Slides
to,
on paper. This is
Yes.
taking it back.
just to give you a sense, you can see in the first figure, there's this big decline from 1967 to 2007 in the proportion of workers who are part of a union. So starting, around 28% in 1967, down to close to 12% in 2010. This is public and private sector workers. And the tragic thing is that just as you see the decline in the labor movement, you also see the decline in the middle class. The second line there is the proportion of income going to the middle 3/5. You can see it's almost a perfect correlation, the decline of organized labor and the decline of the middle class. It used to be, looking at the second slide, that there was, you saw wages increase as productivity increased throughout the 1940s, 1950s, part of the 1960s. So it used to be that workers got the gains in productivity. And then as labor weakened, you can see the lines diverge where productivity continued to increase and yet hourly compensation and hourly wages did not. The last slide, and then I'll stop, has to do with the explanation for this. A lot of people think that labor declined because of globalization and international competition and the downward pressure on wages that comes with globalization. And there is some truth to that narrative. But you can see in this last figure that there are a lot of other countries that have much, much stronger labor movements than we have. If you look at the European countries on kind of the right side of the figure there, they will have 60, 70, 80, 90% of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements. The U.S., it's closer to 10%. And that's correlated directly with degrees of inequality in the society. So if you care about inequality, I think you have to care about the decline of labor that we've seen over the last several years.
Okay, so you talked about a few factors there that have changed and that have participated in this decline of labor organizing. But what else has changed in this landscape? Are the laws changing in response to it, or are there other factors? Are employers changing?
I'll just say something quickly, and then the two of you should jump in. I think we saw a big change in the culture. The laws did change in the sense that we had the Taft-Hartley Act in the 1940s that weakened labor laws. But I think even more dramatically, the culture changed, where employers started to break the labor laws and to do it openly. In the 1950s, there was kind of a consensus in this country that a vibrant labor movement was part of what you needed in a democracy and in order to encourage the growth of the middle class. And then, particularly in the early 80s with Ronald Reagan, there was a new ethos that took hold where employers became militantly anti-union and would routinely fire employees who were trying to organize a union. That's technically illegal under the National Labor Relations Act, but the penalties are so weak that employers kind of will break the law and then pay the small penalties as a cost of doing business. So I think there was a cultural change that led in large measure to this big decline.
Yeah.
I would agree that there's a culture change that's happening. I think it was actually happening in a lot of different arenas at the same time. I mean, and there are also just structural changes in the economy that went along with changes in the political culture. For instance, we had a massive wave of deindustrialization just on the cusp of Reaganism. And, you know, it's obviously hard to disentangle cause from effect, but you can certainly see sort of a through line between the rise of the Reagan era, the rise of a consumer economy. You know, we switched at some point from being a country that was largely, where our growth was largely based on producing things, to one where our growth is largely premised on a constant rate of consumption. And along with that come the cultural changes that come with being part of a very consumer-oriented economy. I would also say that, I mean, when I interview, you know, sort of these old kind of labor movement stalwarts, a lot of them kind of reflect with some iteration of we were kind of victims of our own success, which is to say that even the culture within labor unions started to shift as they became more and more established. They became large bureaucracies. The culture of the way organizing worked changed. And frankly, I mean, the stereotype that these are largely dominated by, you know, white men of certain sectors of the economy predominated. And they did not end up changing along with the times in the 1970s and the 1980s, you know, not through any fault of their own. I think a lot of that was because there was an ideology of divisiveness and inequality that was kind of promulgated on a very large scale. But just to say that, you know, there are a lot of different social dynamics going on. And I think we could certainly make the case that without a labor movement, there would be no civil rights movement. On the other hand, there is a very pretty distinct break between sort of the civil rights movement kind of milieu and, you know, where labor went, where traditional organized labor went after the 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I often think about the lessons for today and the organizing work that we're doing and the way that we relate to the way workers articulate their wants and needs. Back to the beginning of the decline of the labor movement in the early 1970s, which was really tied up in these bureaucracies that felt that their job was to maintain wages and benefits and tended not to listen to workers when they expressed dissatisfaction with maybe working on assembly lines that were dehumanizing or working in environments where they really had wanted more. And that's not, I mean, this was all happening in the context of a really focused and thoughtful attack on unions that went on for 30 years. So that is the fault of the decline, but I also do think that people began to lose faith in their institutions because they were not reflecting the fullness of what their hopes and dreams were. So while they would go to the bargaining table and focus exclusively on pay and benefits, and not on, you know, speeding up the line or, you know, I'm thinking a lot of there's an uprising at Lordstown in early 1970s in Ohio where the workers basically were protesting both their employer and their union. And so what's important to me about that is that we need to apply that lesson to the way that we're thinking about organizing workers now when we're looking at the changes in the economy that allow for more flexibility. And we have this motivation as labor organizers to want to keep everybody in sort of very traditional full-time employment because that gives you access to a suite of benefits. But we could be thinking more expansively about the way that we're creating opportunities for people to work more agilely and work more flexibly. So I feel like that's what is such a lesson from the previous decline of labor for the future.
Okay, so it's a lot of things that have changed, but what hasn't changed really since Taft-Hartley at least is the laws around unions that sort of keep them as the main organizing unit. I think, Rick, your book is at least largely about this. What can be done on sort of the governmental end to try and revitalize labor, and what changes could we hope for?
Yeah. And let me answer that and also pick up on what the two Michelles said. So I agree that the labor movement itself is partly to blame for the situation that it finds itself in. But I think Leanne, the laws are incredibly important here. Freedom House, which is kind of a center or even center-right organization, looks at the degree of freedom throughout the world on a number of different levels. But they put out one report on labor rights. Who is free to join a labor union? And the U.S. was less free than 41 other nations. And the reason is that we have these weak labor laws that worked when there was a kind of a political and cultural consensus that labor unions were an important part of our democracy, but have become ineffective since then. So what is the best way to stop a unionizing drive? If there are workers who are disgruntled and are trying to put together a union, fight for better wages together, the single best way to stop that is to fire a couple of the ringleaders, because everyone else becomes scared, right? Congressman Ellison says, you know, people might want a union, but they need a job. And so employers have found that this is a brilliant way to stop unionizing drives. And the penalty under the current law is to give back wages to an employee who was illegally fired or otherwise demoted, and to give him or her the job back, so to be reinstated. So very, very weak penalties. By contrast, under our civil rights laws, if you are discriminated against, not for union organizing, but for race or sex or national origin, religion, the penalties are more substantial. You have the right to go to federal court, to engage in discovery, to get compensatory and punitive damages up to $300,000, and you can get attorney's fees if you prevail. So it's not that our civil rights laws are perfect, but they're much stronger than our labor laws. And so what my colleague Moshe Marvit and I argue is that we should amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that protects against these various categories of discrimination to apply to people trying to organize a union. So if you're discriminated against for exercising what is the United Nations UN Declaration of Human Rights recognizes as a basic human right to go with your colleagues and organize a union, to fight for better wages and the like. If you're discriminated on those grounds, that you should have access to the same penalties. Congressman Keith Ellison from Minnesota, Congressman John Lewis, the two of them have put together legislation along these lines, and are arguing for civil rights protections for labor. And it seems to me that's one way to try to change the culture on this issue. It is now, thankfully, shameful for a corporation to discriminate based on race. That's not to say it's ended, but if they're found guilty, it's a real mark on their image. There's not a similar cultural penalty attached to firing people for labor organizing, and that's part of what we hope to accomplish.
So we've talked a fair amount about traditional labor unions, but there seems to be a pretty vibrant culture growing around alternative labor unions, or not even unions, but worker centers, things like that. And I was wondering what all three of you think about that, and whether it's likely to be a more successful model, and why.
Well, I think the worker centers that I've reported on are fairly recently established phenomenon. Most of them are organizing in sectors that have traditionally been unorganized. Either they have never had, an incumbent union, or they're industries that just cropped up, in recent years, or they were once unionized, and and those early efforts sort of petered out. I think a lot of the reason worker centers have been getting a lot of attention lately is because they actually, not so much because they wield so much clout in terms of sheer numbers of people that they've organized, but because they actually represent sort of a symbol, a model of organizing that is sort of, in a way, that is sort of outside this legal apparatus that's grown up around the National Labor Relations Board and the NLRA. Which definitely has its merits and is very instructive in a lot of ways from an organizing standpoint. But of course, if we're talking about changing the sort of intersection between culture and law, right, then we also have to think about changing laws. But I mean, what's interesting about worker centers is that they've actually been able to make strides in legal advocacy, not so much in the organization of unions themselves, but in terms of, say, like raising the minimum wage, right? Or, pushing for things like card check, or even, pressuring employers to not engage in discriminatory practices, which again relate back to the Civil Rights Act and civil rights protections. And often they are representing, women, people of color, immigrants, undocumented immigrants especially, and people who have been left out. And so that in and of itself is a very interesting way of approaching disenfranchised groups, short of giving them an actual union card or short of granting them citizenship, right? They find these sort of ad hoc ways of organizing that can apply pressure from the ground up, and they don't have to, have a secret ballot election or whatever. So, I mean, that is useful. But, of course, that also comes with huge limitations. And I think what the labor movement in general, labor movement in the broadest sense, is wrestling with right now is how those two forces interact with each other. Do we change the system structurally using the law, or, we have so many instances in movements where the law has been an ass, and how many how much union financing dollars have been spent on endless litigation and running things like organizing drives that end up going nowhere. So those are these the good and the bad that you kind of take together.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to come at this question from I think the labor movement cannot be just one thing. And so I really am thrilled with the growth of the Worker Center movement. And we partner with them a lot at coworker.org. Most of the big ones use our platform to reach workers in geographies that are outside of their local reach. And what I feel like we're seeing is that they are coming up with innovative new models for workers to build power that sit beside the NLRA-style trade union. And, we could make an argument that the reason that it was so successful to focus for 30 years on destroying trade unions was because they were basically what an old advisor used to tell me, like fish in a barrel. It's like, there's just this one model, and if you decide to take out this model from a number of angles, you can eventually tear it apart. And so I think that when workers who are go to work in a lot of different conditions and work for tons of different kinds of companies and work in many different kinds of work cultures, the idea that we might have some flexible and agile models for them to apply to solving their own problems in their own workplaces, I think that's a great thing. I agree that they haven't built the level of deep, dense power that the trade union movement built for about 20 years in the middle of the 20th century, but I think we can see power manifesting itself in a variety of different ways.
Do you think that these sort of alternative models need legislation to exist with them to protect them from employers doing the kind of things that they do with regular unions now, from harassing and discriminating against employees? And do you think that that's state or national level?
I mean, yeah, it's all broken. Yes, all of it's broken. So yeah, I mean, there need to be a series of laws and policies that re-examine the ways in which, I mean, in a bigger way, I wrote a paper that came out today where I basically say the entire worker safety net, from trade unions to all the agencies to all the policies that protect workers to social insurance programs, are all rooted on an industrial employee-employer relationship that is just not working anymore. And so we need a wholesale revamp of the laws and policies that protect workers that are actually relevant to what they're facing in workplaces today.
Right.
So, yeah.
So yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
If I can just jump in, I think the alt labor movement is very exciting. We need something parallel to the change in the laws that we have. Certainly, what I was talking about, amending the Civil Rights Act, is not going to happen, with John Boehner and Mitch McConnell in charge. But I do think we can start to make some changes at the state and local level. This is something that Leanne has been investigating for us this summer, but that's a strategy that the right wing has used very effectively with the passage of so-called right-to-work laws and a number of other methods for cutting back on labor rights at the state and local level. And I think we have to figure out if we want to eventually change the laws and change the culture of the country, we need a movement. And one way to start that is to find states and local cities, municipalities where you do have a progressive majority, where you could begin to establish this notion that labor organizing is a civil right, and it should be recognized as such. I mean, my hope is that even in using that rhetoric, that we will try to appeal to people who are the age of those here in the audience, who are looking for what's that next civil rights movement that I want, what can I get excited about? And it seems to me that if we start at the state and local level, eventually we'll get to the point where when all the stars are aligned again, you can see federal action.
On the point about the intersection between law and labor movements, I mean, I think that even though worker centers and other such groups are not formal unions and they don't have formal sort of legal status, they've been able to do a lot of really innovative things using the law that they probably couldn't do as labor unions. For instance, lobby for legislation, put direct pressure on candidates and get laws passed. I mean, they craft laws, right? So you see San Francisco, you have the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights. It just passed in New York. We have the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, similar initiatives cropping up all over the country. And maybe what ties all these things together, I think, when we think about it in a broad sense, is the fact that they are not so much focused on the format of the organizing itself, right? They're not pushing for a protection of the organizational structure, right? They are pushing for benefits. They're pushing for like bread and butter things that their people need. And that's a reflection of the circumstances that they're working under, right? I mean, you're gonna, I think a lot of domestic workers who pushed through the Bill of Rights were okay with not having a collective bargaining provision in the final bill because they were like, look, this is gonna get me overtime and is gonna prevent my employer from exploiting me by making me work 16 hours a day. I'll take it, right? But the next step, right, is how do we start to enshrine those rights? And I was just thinking of another way the law has worked with labor is through Supreme Court decisions. And I can't think of any, right now we have the Friedrichs case and we had the Harris v. Quinn case in this last session, all really pivotal decisions that are going to have a huge impact on the right to organize in a formal union setting. And I think it would be really interesting to see if there's anything on the horizon where a worker center or a workers' legal defense organization is bringing some kind of thing to the Supreme Court to actually set a precedent, because that would actually be more structural than just pushing for a local ordinance or something.
Right. What makes me curious in this then is that we've talked about a sort of, as much as there are common goals, a distinct division between traditional labor unions and this sort of alternative movement. In what realms can they really work effectively together? And have you seen that yet? Or is this something that needs to be worked on to sort of push worker rights and labor organizing collectively?
Is there one union person?
It was open to all.
Do you mean how have traditional labor unions and worker centers been able to work in a sort of complementary way? I mean, well, the AFL has affiliate worker centers, and they work very closely with those and provide support to those workers. And I think in some circumstances, some of those workers may have eventually organized into traditional trade unions. I mean, the work feels so complementary, especially, as the point that Michelle was making about the incredible legislative and lobbying work that worker centers are able to do. The trade union movement benefits from creating legislation that further protects workers and establishes workers as people with rights. Generally, the more people are attempting to organize and learning the process of actually organizing and workplace advocacy, no matter at what level, I mean, they do eventually decide often that they would like to have a union. Like, after you've gone through this process of attempting to collectively advocate for yourself in a variety of ways, what we've seen is that there are often workers that get to the point of actually wanting to organize a union. And the difference is that they've then gone through a sort of ad hoc DIY training process where they have more of a sense of how to do this and how to maybe potentially be successful than if they were just cold calling a local and saying, we'd like to organize now.
Right.
Yeah. And there's fewer barriers to entry when you just want to, I mean, it's just workers getting together with like a gripe, and then they start to organize or get a petition together. You don't have to go through all those, jump through all the bureaucratic hoops of going through the NLRB process, because that can actually open you up to being sued by your employer for doing something that's out of line. So the flexibility, again, I think is important. One example of worker center stuff and unions being sort of complementary, is going to say would be like the fast food workers movement, which is not tied to a single worker center, but certainly that's one sort of arena where you see everyone sort of uniting under this banner of helping to organize these low-wage workers. And now that's spread to sort of, it's now just generally this big fight for 15 umbrella. So now you have all sorts of different sectors fitting under that that one hashtag. And I think it's grown, and it's been, I mean, for the most part, it's been bankrolled, as far as I know, by SEIU and pretty much like no one else. But they kind of it's sort of like the fast food workers movement is like the attack dog, and like SEIU is like the sort of like the marionette kind of like guy behind the scenes. And of course that's going to fuel all these conspiracy theories that are dropped by like the right-wing think tanks who are saying like, oh, it's just a front group for SEIU, so you have to deal with the optics of that, right? But I think that having people sort of see ways that their lives can immediately materially benefit from organizing can help get rid of some of the stigma and I guess some of the kind of cultural resistance to organizing. And I think people may not know what the legal definition of collective bargaining is, right, in their heads, and there are certain instances in which it's illegal to say you're a collective bargaining unit, and there are laws surrounding constraining the use of that a specific format, but everyone knows what it means intuitively, right, to get together with your coworkers and press your boss for higher wages. So
this is a crucial point I think you're making. The financing of the worker centers and these various efforts has to come from somewhere. And maybe some foundations will support it, but ultimately you need some kind of mechanism like a labor union that collects dues from members for the collective good that will provide the support necessary.
Yeah, especially when you have a lot of worker centers that are funded by philanthropic grants, and that creates this whole other kettle of fish in terms of not just, for one, conflict of interest, but two, just sustainability. I mean, you need a full-time person on your 3-person worker center staff writing grant applications every day.
So there's been a lot of grassroots organizing going on, is what I'm hearing from you guys, which is exciting, but I'm also curious about how technology can play into that in the future and where that can play a role in trying to make this a bigger movement again.
Well, I can speak to that. I run a technology platform that provides tools to workers to organize their own workplaces. And so what the way that we got started doing this was that we actually, my co-founder and I, saw workers attempting to use popular technology tools to organize around issues that mattered to them. And at that point, what those tools did was it allowed them to take that first step of actually just forming a collective and naming a problem that they were experiencing and identifying other people in their workplace that were experiencing that same problem. The difference with technology is that that workplace suddenly becomes global. And so instead of, if you are a Starbucks barista in your store, being able to get the other 6 people that you see, you're able to recruit thousands of them from all over the world. And that level of density changes your ability to actually make change inside your workplace. So I'd say technology in the first place just creates these opportunities to form global collectives that are unprecedented, that we've never had before. And the practice of engaging in social media has elements of organizing baked into it, where you are asserting an idea and then seeing who else likes it and wants to engage with it. And then the discussion formats that happen under the way that you establish that idea, or the back and forth. I mean, this is what happens in back rooms when people are organizing all the time, is like people talking about the thing that they would like to see change or be different and arguing about it. And then the second thing, I mean, there are lots of things, but then the second thing is these agencies that we talk about, the NLRB, the DOL, OSHA Wage and Hour, they are currently very unnavigable by individual people who actually want to figure out how to leverage them in their own interest. Like, if you want to find out, because I have been through this many times, oh, can workers talk to the media about the thing that they're doing, or are they going to get in trouble? Trying to just like find the answer to those simple questions is nearly impossible. OSHA, you know, if you know the exact legal definition for the bad thing that happened to you when you got hurt at work, you might be able to find out if it's illegal or not. But if you are describing falling in a puddle by the elevator in your own words, you're never going to be able to navigate that website so that you can find the things that you need to actually file a grievance or a complaint. And so what technology can do is suddenly make these agencies navigable. And I think that the potential of that, and the potential for people to actually be able to find information, to share data, could have an incredible impact on people's ability to organize.
And also the workers themselves, who are increasingly working in the digital realm.
Right.
Right. You're reaching a lot more people, and it's, you know, the way we interact with our coworkers, right, is obviously different. You would know from the name of your organization. The sense that there's a different sense of, and on the one hand, people lament the expansion of technology in the workplace as a way of atomizing the workforce or dehumanizing the workforce. On the other hand, you can think of it as, well, we're actually dramatically expanding our sense of what is collective, right? And how sort of the hive mind kind of works together. But of course, technology is obviously always a double-edged sword. So just as fast as employers are learning ways to manipulate the technology to, put pressure on workers, to keep people divided, to keep workers in the dark about what their real working conditions are. There needs to be an equal and a counterbalancing force that's of even greater weight that can actually put technology back in the hands of the people who frankly make it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the circuit boards are made by real people at the end of the day. And so it's that kind of finding a way to rehumanize technology rather than being either frightened of it or being enslaved by it. So.
I totally agree with that. And I'm very excited about what Michelle Miller's group has been doing. Management has been using technology for a long time in order to disempower workers, and this flips it on its head and provides an opportunity for workers to come together. We at the Century Foundation, Mark Zuckerman and Moshe Marvit and I have a piece that I think complements the work that you're doing, Michelle, and argues for using technology as a way of organizing a union, and suggests that when workers use technology on their own to begin that process, they are able to defang the argument made by management that, well, the union is an outside group coming in and imposing its will on workers. And when it starts with workers and is clearly an organic process, that provides a very, very different setting than a traditional union organizing tribe. So that's Lucy would want me to say that's available on our website. I think it's on the I think it's on the homepage. So virtual labor organizing, if any of you are interested in that.
So before we go to questions from the audience, one last question. We have an audience that is at least largely composed of generally youthful people. And I think, roughly speaking, I think a lot of us are probably wondering, what can we do to make this an energetic movement again and to really get it going and make it successful and build it back up?
Well, you are all workers, so I mean, what I think
must unite. Cast off your chain.
I mean, maybe. I mean, we can all advocate for ourselves in our own workplaces. We don't necessarily have to form unions, but we can engage in some levels of advocacy and support people who are attempting to change their own workplaces and other spots.
Yeah, I mean, as I've been reporting on, some of the union organizing going on at Gawker and sort of these places where you never thought, labor organizing in the traditional sense would emerge, but lo and behold, you actually see new models of organizing coming up from below, and it's not really like, I guess the name of this event is apropos, but it's not doing the things the way they were done before. It's looking at things the way they are now and responding to current circumstances, and also drawing lessons from the past. And I guess, one of my other hats is that I study history at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and one of the really interesting things that I've always found is just reading history, right? And reading the history of movements and seeing what people did before you. Not to kind of put it in a box and be like, oh, those are the days and everyone was wearing suspenders and Dickies, but but to see how those forms of organizing endure over time, right? And how the human needs don't change, right? The impulse to reach out to people who are in your peer group and form collective power that way doesn't change, right? It's just that the setting changes and the forces that you're up against, the face of those forces change. But understanding that there are structures in place that endure over time, over generations even, is really useful as kind of a way to anchor yourself in this digital ether that we're all in.
I would just say, your generation is one that is defined by addressing this issue of economic inequality. I mean, this is the key issue, and you cannot address that without, in some form, engaging in collective action through labor unions or alternative methods. I mean, I was struck by Obama's second inaugural speech, where he talked about, you'll all remember, Seneca Falls and Stonewall and Selma. And those are all glorious movements. But what was missing from that trilogy? It was the labor movement. And that, it seems to me, reigniting labor, reinventing it in new ways, has to be at the center of our methods of addressing economic inequality. And so whether that means, developing an app that will help people organize in the workplace more effectively, or becoming part of a local movement to ensure that the civil rights of individuals are protected in the workplace, and that you can't be fired for exercising your kind of fundamental First Amendment right to assemble with others and become part of a movement for collective action. So I think there are lots of things to do, and if you are trying to define the needs of the time, this is the answer, I think.
Okay, so we're going to have questions from the audience. We have somebody walking around with the microphone, so if you can wait until the microphone gets to you, and then give your name and who you're affiliated with. Either one, Sean.
Hi, my name's Caitlin. I'm a lobbyist here in the city, and we talked a little bit about the Fight for 15 and fast food workers, and I think it makes a lot of sense to most people why collective bargaining would be something that would be beneficial to them. They have wage and benefit issues, and they also have quality of working condition issues. But I'm a little curious about what some more solidly middle-class occupations might see as the incentive for labor organizing when they might only have one of those issues, right? Like, their quality of work is fine because they work at a nonprofit, but they're not so happy with their wages and benefits, or their wages and benefits are okay because they work in a private organization, but they're not so happy with the quality of their work environment. What's the incentive for them to organize? And if there isn't an incentive, is there even a need for them to organize? Is it all just about sort of this low wage sector?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, for middle class workers, what we've seen is a lot of organizing and advocacy around paid parental leave, which is a huge issue. And there's definitely an ultimate federal policy goal there, but for now, paid family leave policies in companies are really uneven. There's relatedly, like, flexibility around childcare. And then there's just the entire issue of time. Middle-class workers are on their phones until they go to bed and when they get up, and their lives are dominated by their jobs for enormous amounts of uncompensated time. And I think that would be, I mean, those are just some things that we've heard from middle-class workers that they are interested in organizing around. And, you know, middle-class workers, we're all basically at-will employees in this country, and being able to be fired for no reason, no cause, seems like something that would really contribute to your lack of economic stability. So, I mean, I think there are things that people would like to organize around. I will say that that the sort of us against them mode of organizing and campaigning that works in much more stark workplaces does not work for middle class workers. And we've talked a lot about this at Coworker, is like, how do we create, eventually we want collaborative spaces where people can noodle around on things that they want to think about fixing in their own workplaces. And that seems like a space that might be much more conducive to middle class workers who are trying to come up with new solutions to problems, who maybe are not quite likely to go out and, you know, write an all caps headline on a petition and yell at their boss.
But you can do that too.
They can. They are welcome to.
I'm kind of embarrassed that we didn't actually really mention class until like the Q&A session. But I think that's actually one very useful like touchstone whenever you talk about labor, especially labor movements in this country, because there's this kind of received wisdom that middle class workers do not need labor organizing, right? Or the idea that once you're sort of safely ensconced in that strata that we call the middle class, right, that you're suddenly invincible to all forms of economic instability. And we see that as increasingly not true. And I actually think that like labor organizing is even more vital for like middle class workers in some ways, because they are the ones that are at the front lines right now of where industrial workers were a generation ago, which is where they're feeling the force of globalization. They're seeing their jobs being outsourced and offshored and turned into temp jobs when they used to be steady staff, full-time union jobs before. I mean, like, where is the expansion of freelance labor, right? This readily exploitable pool of labor. It's people who are like, you know, poor, right? But they have college degrees and they're used to thinking of themselves as not blue collar, right? Or that somehow their class in life or the culture that they grew up in, right, somehow immunizes them from the types of precarious precarity and just economic insecurity that everyone else suffers from. But I think what we saw with like the Occupy Wall Street movement and this kind of social movements that grew out of that, is that you actually see people who once thought of themselves as middle class realizing like, no, I'm actually working class, right? Or I'm actually whatever the new working class is, which is just basically everyone who's just hustling, right? And actually what I see a lot, like in my everyday life, is that like a lot of the people who are the least economically secure are the ones who, on paper should have the least to worry about. So I think, and that could be actually where I think the next sort of like vanguard of the labor movement could be, because whereas you see low-wage workers, fighting for just the ability to like earn a minimum wage, right, or to earn something close to a living wage, or to get a day off once a week, right? That is like the basic bread and butter issue that they're advocating around. But you also have IBM workers, digital journalism workers, and those types of people who can actually, maybe they have some sort of like modicum of economic insecurity, where they can think in more theoretical terms about what do I want my workplace to be, and they're empowered to actually act on that.
I think teachers are a good example of a group that has recognized that they need unions. I wrote a biography of Albert Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and when he first started organizing teachers in New York City in the 1960s, he got this reaction, well, we're college educated, we're professionals, kind of that the unions are beneath us. And he asked, are you being well treated on the job? How's the principal? Does the principal respect you? Do you feel like you have adequate wages and benefits? And the answer in each case was no. And so we saw the public sector union movement grow dramatically because there was an appetite for union protection. And now we're kind of relearning this lesson again in the charter school sector, where we have in charter schools, almost none of the teachers are unionized. And we're seeing in school after school after school now, teachers who thought they were part of kind of this exciting movement of entrepreneurial movement that didn't need unions, recognizing, well, in fact, this would be much better for us. There's tremendous turnover among teachers in the charter school movement sector, in part because they don't feel like they have adequate voice in the workplace. They'd like to be involved in decision making over who the new hires are in the school, in addition to some of those bread and butter issues. So I think we need unions in the middle class, in part to keep people in the middle class, but also to deal with a lot of issues that come up in the workplace where people would like greater small d democratic voice.
So we ran a little long on the discussion earlier, so we probably only have time for two more questions. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Mariah Kaplan. I have a question which is not unconnected to the question we just answered about organizing the middle class. I would love to hear you talk about the growth of the tech sector, not just digital print, but also programming, Google, Facebook, the app companies, and the recent decision that was made in California, and how some of those things impact the labor movement and any prospects for growth the labor movement might have kind of within the tech sector.
Are you talking about the California Uber decision, where they decided that the driver was an employee?
Yeah, I mean, that would be one, but I think just in generally, like programming and the growth.
Yeah, I actually had a friend who was a coder once, and we had an interesting discussion about like how damn hard it was to get his coworkers who are also programmers to like want to organize anything. I think there's like a cultural, maybe like a bit of an allergy, or I mean, this could obviously just be a stereotype, but I think there's just sort of a presumption that like coders are these kind of like strange, like lonely, geeky people who don't like to do anything collective with anyone, and that's why they're coders. But I think, to break from that stereotype, I think that you also see some of the most innovative forms of collective action and direct action going on online, and that's all obviously very much sort of both facilitated by and very much like rooted in technology, and often like the technology itself becomes sort of the political sort of meat of a movement. I mean, if you just look at the advocacy that's going on around surveillance, right, and privacy, and those are things where you don't separate the medium from the message. Whereas, like, you know, your right to speak out in this medium is very much your right to exist, you know, in a digital world. So I think that could be you know, and they may not call it a labor movement, right? I think a lot of the new organizing you need to do needs to, like, stop calling ourselves a labor movement, and then maybe more people pay attention to us. Yeah, and I think what we saw with Gawker, I think, was interesting, and also, you know, these other outlets like Truth Out and Salon, they're seeing that you know, they actually, you know, people often maybe thought of freelancer gig work as something that you just did until you went on to the next thing, and now people are starting to realize that, like, this is, I mean, by choice or by necessity, this is going to be the rest of my life, right? So you need to start putting down roots where you are and making your workplace better instead of just waiting to, like, hop to the next gig. And I think that can be the basis for, you know, I mean, we talk about a sharing economy, but it's really mostly a stealing economy now. But what if we found ways to really share power in the workplace?
I mean, for workers that are accessing gigs through technology platforms, I feel like there has been a lot of organic collective building in the past couple of years. There's obviously the Turk Opticon and Mechanical Turk workers created a collaborative platform called Dynamo, where task coders come together and discuss issues that they would like to campaign around and advocate for changing. And they vote up or down, just like using a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and then they choose what their campaign is, and they advocate around it, and they've actually been successful on a couple campaigns. And, you know, Uber drivers have found multiple ways to form collectives online and talk to one another about policies. And there's, like, this second generation of tech tools that are developing to both facilitate mutual aid among those groups and also help them communicate with one another in ways that are sort of off-platform. So I think that is actually incredibly promising, and that the labor movement would do well. This is sort of what I was getting at the very beginning, is would do well to acknowledge the benefits of working in a freelance or gig-based environment where you do have ownership over your time, you do have flexibility, and that matters to people a lot. And so when we're thinking about what we're advocating for in terms of creating the economic stability for those workers, making sure that we preserve that quality of life factor while also thinking about ways to introduce the social safety net into those jobs.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Up front.
Sweet. Hi, my name is Pearl. I'm a fourth generation union member, and I also work for a union. And I work in the entertainment industry, which is a bit of a magical unicorn in that it's a highly unionized environment. And the thing that I've noticed is the trouble that a lot of unions that have been around for a while in the entertainment industry are not really evolving with their membership. And there are instances, specifically for the union I work for, where members are actually doing everything that they can to fight their union to be able to work for free. And I just wanted to see if you guys had any thoughts on how traditional unions should and need to evolve in order to keep the pride that used to be amongst their members.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I'll talk. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, one thing that a lot of traditional unions could do better is provide opportunities for workers to actually run their own campaigns and assert their own issues and determine the things that they actually want to work around. We work with some unions as a platform where their members can just start campaigns on anything they care about, and that doesn't have to be controlled or facilitated by that union. And it's been incredibly successful. It makes people feel a sense of ownership over the organization that they're a part of. I don't think it's going to help unions to continue to feel compelled to control every aspect of the way organizing happens. And I have sympathy for that because there's a lot at stake for people if something goes wrong. And I understand why you would want to stick with the model. But I think it does make people feel really alienated from their own unions when they don't feel like they have a voice or any ability to assert their vision for how they would like their work to be conducted.
Just maybe from a historic. Well, actually, I'm curious as to how they resolve that "we want to work for free" issue that you were referring to before. Are you talking about people who wanted to do, like actors or somebody who wanted to work, do a stage play for free or something like that? Yeah. And how did they resolve that ultimately?
There's no mic, but I'll
okay.
talk loud. Well, actually, in the 80s, a group of actors in LA sued Actors Equity Association for the ability to work for free, and there was a non-employment code that was created called the 99-seat plan. And earlier this year, the Council of Actors Equity announced that they were going to be revising that plan, and there's a huge outcry amongst a lot of actors in LA who saw this as their acting class, their gym, their way of getting their art out there while they went up for auditions for film and TV gigs. There was a vote amongst the LA members, 2/3 of which voted to not change the 99-seat plan, and it was a non-binding vote, and it went to the Equity Council, and the council did vote to revise it substantially. That happened in May.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I remember reading about that, but I'm just curious. I mean, I think, like you said, the entertainment unions they're not traditional. I mean, to begin with, I mean, they have their internal sort of conflicts, but I mean, even the way equity works now is, I mean, it is like essentially the first really gig economy union that really existed, right? So I think that maybe, I mean, I was going to say, God, I was looking towards equity as like a potential model for the next but yeah, I think that speaks to just the idea that things need to be constantly evolving. I think a lot of the interesting sort of of campaigns that I've seen come up in the labor movement have come from strong rank and file movements, and I think there needs to be sort of a more institutionalized place for that, not, to recognize that there needs to be dissent within a union, but also to sort of reserve a space, in everyone's sort of collective organizing hive mind to recognize that there can't be, even the most traditional labor movements have never grown without some sort of strong rank and file sort of element to them. And if you want to keep on recruiting new members, I mean, no one wants to join a sclerotic bureaucracy that's been doing the same thing for 40 years. Because you don't people gravitate towards organizing because they want to change things. So if they can't change the organization that's helping them change things, then that's a dilemma. So.
Yeah. I'll just say I think you've identified a really important issue. I mean, the whole strength of the union movement is that it is supposed to be small d democratic. That's what drives me nuts about the label union boss. These are democratically elected individuals. He's not a boss in that sense. There are some unions that don't operate very democratically, and I think they forfeit the moral high ground, and also forfeit strength ultimately. Because if you do not have, as you said, Michelle, if you don't have engaged members, then when you call a strike or when you call a demonstration and people don't feel invested, they won't show up. So ultimately, it's in the self-interest of unions to be more democratic.